Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new here. So this is the Land Rover Series III Build Diary Part 2, and I have been extremely busy over the past month trying to get Part 2 ready, and I'm so excited to show you all what I have been up to. First and foremost, I've actually been teaching myself how to weld, because I've got a lot of work to do on my second Land Rover, which is a 110. So I thought it was finally time to, teach myself how to weld, laying down a few beads. I started with stick. I intend to go on to MIG and possibly TIG one day. For now, I'm just trying to lay down a few beads, really get my technique right before I move on to MIG. And then, of course, when I finally learn how to weld, I will be making a welding table. So please just excuse the ladders, because I do actually plan on building myself a welding table at some point. So the main attraction of today's video is the brand new galvanised chassis from Galvanised Chassis. Unfortunately, the chassis on my Series 3 wasn't worth saving and it couldn't be sensibly patched, so I'm absolutely over the moon with my Galvanised chassis. I got a bulkhead from them as well, so I'm absolutely over the moon. I can't really fault their products. If you are interested, I'm going to leave a link in the description box below, so you can go and check them out. They cater to not only Series but Defender as well. So I'm just filing down a few burrs that happen when the chassis is being galvanised and it's going through that process, as I am going to paint it and I don't want these little bits poking through, that top coat, so it's just best practice, to file those down. So after going around the chassis and filing those burrs down, I am now jet washing just to get any debris off, that loose little bits of dust from transit, or inevitably it's going to have acquired some dirt and some debris, so it's best practice just to jet wash that off and get it ready for a good scrub before you go in for painting. I'm now spraying on some TFR, traffic film remover. It's a great all-round multi-purpose cleaner. It'll cut through grime really well, especially in this application. I'm then agitating it with a brush. You'll probably notice that there are poly bushes already installed into this chassis, so that's another job off the list. I decided to go with a galvanised chassis because the Galv is a sacrificial coating, so it's an added layer of protection for the chassis underneath, because when corrosion happens, and it inevitably will, it'll have to get through and eat through that Galv before it can start penetrating the actual chassis underneath. Because I have future-proofing in mind with this vehicle, it was particularly important for me to get a galvanised chassis and a galvanised bulkhead, and then I'm just jet washing that off there. Okay, so I've now flipped the chassis. This just helps get into different angles, cleaning all those little nooks and crannies. Again, jet washing, then agitating with a brush and TFR, and then giving it a final rinse. It's important to bear in mind the weight of these chassis, because even though this is only a short wheelbase, it did take 2 or 3 of us, just to make sure that we didn't scrape it when we were flipping the chassis, propping it up against something. So same process as before. What I did to the chassis, I'm doing for my new Galvanised bulkhead. So even though it was only the footwells that had gone in the old bulkhead, I decided I wanted to future-proof this vehicle as much as possible, so that's why I went with a brand new bulkhead. The chassis is on its stands now. The reason it's outdoors is simply because I don't have an indoor space big enough. And it's only a chassis, so if a bug falls on it, it's not the end of the world. Unfortunately, when we were moving it, it did acquire a bit of grass and mud, so I'm just jet washing that off now. After the jet washing process, giving it a clean down again, I am just toweling it off now, trying to get it as dry as possible for the next stage. I'm going round now with some brake cleaner and a towel, just giving that a little clean off to remove those finer contaminants, because you don't want anything like that mixing with your paint, and it gets it ready for that next stage then, for it to fully dry. This is my Clark compressor. It's a 200 litre 18 CFM triple piston compressor. It's more than adequate for my HVLP gun, and this is the regulator filter. It's necessary for spraying to separate the water so it doesn't contaminate the air. I'm just giving it a quick blow off now to ensure no water got trapped in those little nooks and crannies, and it just helps speed up that drying process then. Going straight in with the Mordant T-Wash solution. I got this from Arkwright. You can't paint directly to Galv because the T-Wash solution stabilises the Galv and gives it an etch prime, and this means it's got a good key then to be painted. So I applied this all over on each side of the chassis with 2 brushes. I used one large brush, just to get a lot of the solution on that chassis, give it a good coating, and then I just used a second little smaller brush to get in those little nooks and crannies where it needs to be covered. You'll see the chemical reaction happening as it's going on now. After leaving the T-Wash for a quarter of an hour, about 20 minutes, after the T-Wash has done its work, I rinse it off to neutralise it, as it's essentially an acid. This product does recommend that you apply your primer or paint within the first 48 hours of applying the T-Wash and washing it off. So that's what I've done here. I double checked the weather to make sure that I could, because I am painting outdoors, that I could actually paint and the weather would hold up and it wouldn't rain on me, so that I could then apply that first coat within 48 hours as the product specifies. But this is just what I've done. I think if you do it after this time, the results won't be as good, so I just wanted to follow that best practice again and do what the product recommends. Just giving it a little helping hand now just to dry, as I've done before. So this is just the chassis fully dry now, and as the product recommends, I am going to be applying the primer within the first 48 hours. It were actually within the same day for me because the weather was really nice and it was really warm, so the chassis fully dried off, and with my little helping hand earlier with my air tool, it dried off really nicely. So as the product recommends, I am applying it within the first 48 hours, and that's just how I got my end result. So if you want a similar result, please feel free to follow along. The primer that I used is the Corroless S primer. It's a rust inhibiting primer. I thinned it down to around 10% as it recommends. I tested the paint through my gun to make sure that the fan pattern was right for me. I did that on a scrap bit of metal. The spray gun that I'm using is the DeVilbiss FLG5 with a 1.8 tip. And I would highly recommend that you go and purchase this gun if you are doing a similar thing to me, because it is brilliant. The only thing that I would knock is I had to thin it a little bit more, to around 20%, 30% maybe, because it wouldn't get through the 1.8 tip. So the only thing that I'd do differently is buy the 2mm tip instead. So I'm starting off with stripe coating, and all that means is that the edges get that first layer of paint. The primer and top coat do actually recommend stripe coating, so I'm just doing as the product recommends. Feel free to follow me if you'd like, if you're doing a similar thing, but this is just what I'm doing. This method just allows you to apply paint on those high wear areas, so edges, little brackets, things like that are probably gonna maybe get chipped or that need just a higher and thicker layer of paint laying on them first before you fill in the gaps. As you can see, I'm really trying to focus on getting all those edges stripe coated before I move on to filling in the gaps, because to me this was quite an important step and I wanted to ensure that I was doing every step that the manufacturer recommended to get the best end result. And again, this is just what I'm doing. Feel free to do your own thing. But I just wanted to do what the product recommends, both the primer and the top coat. So whenever I did a new layer, I always ensured just to go over those edges first before I filled in any gaps. If you're wondering why I'm painting the chassis as well, there's 3 top reasons really why I'm painting it. And I know some people might think it's a little bit overkill because even though it's Galv, you know, it's going to last a lot of years, but it's just best to, in my eyes, you know, to future-proof it as much as possible. One of the reasons being it gives it that factory black chassis OEM look then. It looks very original, and that also helps to deter thieves, which is one of my other points, because if a thief sees that it's a galvanised chassis, they'll think it's worth more, and so on and so forth. So it just deters them as well. And of course it adds that extra layer of protection, so not only will it have the Galv as a sacrificial coating, but it'll also have the layers of paint and primer as well. The 2 products that I'm using are rust inhibiting, so it'll just go that extra step to slow down that corrosion. The paint recommends 18 degrees for best drying time, and it was over 18 degrees those days, so I just let it bask in the sunshine as it was doing it and dry, and then I flipped it over in the evening ready for another coat that morning, so it gives it the optimal drying time then for that next coat. I am then going in stripe coating the other side and filling in the gaps as I did before. So this is a little trick to help flip the chassis. This is just what I used. It doesn't cause any damage to the paint or primer, so it's just what we use to flip it. So I'd just like to quickly highlight how important it is to do 2 coats. So this is just after the first coat, and as you can see I've missed some areas, and the second coat will just help to cover those and increase the film thickness as well. I didn't want to overdo it with the first coat and end up making some areas run with the paint being too thick, so I'm just going in now at different angles, just showing how I get in those little crevices, which is difficult anyway with cavitation. So a little bit about Corroless if you haven't heard of the products. They developed the paint for oil rigs, industrial applications, water tanks, etc. The primer is a single pack anti-corrosive and a rust treatment as well. You can apply it with a brush, a roller or spraying like I'm doing. I got 5 litres of this paint, which has covered 2 chassis and 2 coats on each of them. So that's my Series 3 and my 110 as well. It's also covered multiple pieces such as brake backing plates, axles, etc. So that's more than enough paint really. I knew I needed quite a lot, but I couldn't really believe how much paint I actually had left, so really take this into consideration when you are ordering, if you do end up ordering, because I got 5 litres and that was more than enough for what I was doing. I'm now applying to the brake backing plates and the axle and those hubs as well, just all those areas that I mentioned in the last video. I'm now going over them just to give them the same coating as what I'm doing everything else. Now time for the top coat. This is a single pack glass reinforced black rust killing top coat RF16. It contains little glass flakes for that extreme protection, and this combination of the Corroless S primer and glass reinforced top coat is such a good combination, and it claims to last up to 10 years. I used a 1.4 fluid tip. This is just a cheap gun, a cheap HVLP gun. And again, I'm going through that same stripe coating process and then filling in all the areas afterwards, but paying close attention to those edges, any little brackets, you know, just making sure that I build up a good enough layer all over those edges before I move on to the main bits of the chassis, because again, these are the areas that will start to wear more than the other bits. Again, this is just filling in after some stripe coating. I actually had a lot of fun as well while filming this because I genuinely really enjoyed what I was doing. So to me, it wasn't overkill, it was such a good learning experience as well. Again, I'm just waiting about a day or so between coats because the last thing that I want is solvent entrapment. So that basically means when wet paint is trapped between the two different layers, so when the first coat hasn't had enough time, and then I'll go and spray another coat, and then it'll entrap all that solvent and all that wet paint then, and it'll take so much longer to dry, and it just won't dry as nicely as it would if I'd have waited. So I'm just trying to avoid that as much as possible because solvent entrapment is the last thing that I'd like. The chassis is normally touch dry by the evening time, so I'd do it in the morning and then it'd have all day in the sunshine, again above that 18 degrees, and then I'd go ahead and flip it with my two assistants in the evening. So this is the chassis fully coated in the first coat of the glass reinforced RF16 top coat. I found this so therapeutic when I was spraying this on, and it was just boosting my ideas of what I wanted to do, you know, when I started actually getting a rolling chassis together. I was getting quite excited for the next stage. Now I'm applying that final coat, making sure that any little sparse areas where a little bit of that pink primer, that buff colour is coming through, so just making sure that it is all thoroughly covered. Another thing about the RF16 top coat is that it's abrasion resistant, so when you're driving along and your wheels are turning and flicking all those little stones and things off of the road up into your chassis and giving it a mini sandblasting, chipping all that paint away, this top coat is meant to combat that, and it's meant to, any little stone chips, it's meant to just, well, it shouldn't even be bothered about little stone chips and things like that, this paint. It's meant to be abrasion resistant, which I'd be quite excited to put that to the test, to be honest with you. After that, I'm just applying the same glass reinforced top coat to the backing plates and the axle, and I've also applied it to the hubs as well. I've just used the same process. You'll probably see that I've got a table behind me full of 110 parts, as well as a couple of little bits for the series that I am painting. But again, that's for a future video, and I can't wait to share that video with you as well, because I am getting the 110 ready for its MOT. So as you can see, I did forget to mask those threads there on the hubs and the axle threads as well. So I do know I'll have to clean them up now, but just an instant thing, I just completely forgot, if I'm honest. Luckily I didn't make the same mistake with the 110, but these ones I did just completely forget though. So as I say, this is just the hubs. I've applied the same primer and the same top coat to them as well, just to give them the best that I can, really. So thank you so much for watching the video. Part 3 is coming, and more parts in the future, and I'm also working on how I've got my 110 MOT ready as well, so plenty more videos are coming. Any products I'll leave in the description as well, so that you can go and check them out and what I've used. And if you're interested in Shielder's chassis as well, I will leave a link to them. So thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you again very soon.